If you tune out, and I'm just told that this meeting is being recorded, I just got an announcement about that. So I'm rather glad for the record to say that I do not agree with this Masorti rabbi, but I do want to present some of the discussion to you because it's an interesting one, and it's one in which Orthodox rabbis have participated. The question first gets asked in 1920, on the 1st of July, 1920, 4 days after taking office. The High Commissioner to Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel, himself a Jew, asks Rav Kook, he writes a letter to Rav Kook, and he says to Rav Kook, it seems that the city is really coming alive now. Do Jews still need to keep Tisha B'Av? And Rav Kook, who was, as you'll read, I've just written a series, 2 articles about him for the United Daf HaShavos, so in a few weeks' time, you'll be able to read what a creative thinker he was. But sometimes we get a little over-enthusiastic about his creative thinking and forget that he was also an incredibly traditional Orthodox rabbi. And he writes back quite clearly saying, it's very lovely that you asked the question. It's very lovely that you're helping to work towards the Geula and towards creating a Jewish homeland for our people. But the fact of the matter is that while the temple is still not standing, there is no question that we, the Jewish people, have to carry on observing Tisha B'Av. And that's really the end of the question for another 40 years or so. But after the Six-Day War, the question comes up again. In 1967, Yerushalayim has been recaptured. The Jewish people now hold Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, and also the Western Wall. And people are not asking whether they have to keep Tisha B'Av. It's still very clear to everybody that Tisha B'Av is still relevant, and people are still mourning from the Holocaust. It's 5 minutes after the Holocaust, and people understand that we live in a time of catastrophe. But they do ask questions about the liturgy of Tisha B'Av, and that's where it starts to get interesting. Because, as you can see in our first source, is the Amidah from Tisha B'Av. Its source is in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and we'll read it in English because we don't have enormous amounts of time at our disposal. It says, "Comfort, O Lord our God, the mourners of Zion and the mourners of Jerusalem, the city that is in mourning and in ruins, despised and desolate. She's in mourning, for she is without her children, and she's in ruins from her dwellings. She's despised for her loss of glory. She's desolate from having no inhabitants, and sits with her head covered like a barren woman who has not given birth. Legions devoured her. Worshippers of strange gods possessed her. They threw your children Israel by the sword, and in wilfulness they have slain the pious of the Most High." So the question that people start to ask again in 1967, and which I guess becomes even more relevant in 2021, as they look around Yerushalayim, and thank God they see a city that's bustling, that's alive, that now has an American embassy in it, and a few other embassies joining, is that still true? Can we still say that? And the rabbi who contemplates that question, I think in the most beautiful and thoughtful and sensitive way, is Rav Chaim David Halevi. Have any of you come across Rav Chaim David Halevi? I'm not hearing anything, but I guess that's because you've got your microphone switched off. So Rav Chaim David Halevi was born in 1924 in Yerushalayim. He studied under Rav Uziel, who went on to become the chief rabbi of Israel at the Parat Yosef Yeshiva. And when Rav Uziel becomes chief rabbi of Israel, he takes Rav Chaim David Halevi to be his secretary, which does not mean that he's the person typing the letters. It means he's the person kind of involved in everything that Rav Chaim David Halevi does. He himself goes on to become the chief rabbi of Rishon LeZion and the Sephardi chief rabbi of Tel Aviv Yafo. And one of the things that he does, which I think is really lovely, is he takes over, I think from Rav Ovadia Yosef, a radio show. And the radio show is a radio show where people phone in and they ask their halachic questions, which means that you get an extraordinary range of questions. And many of the questions are not kind of classic questions that you find in Shelot Utshuvot. They're the questions that are bothering people on that particular day. So, for example, one of his questions, which I think is fascinating, is he has a lengthy discussion about transcendental meditation. He confronts really, really modern questions. He confronts them in lovely Hebrew. His Hebrew is very easy to read, and with a kind of very modern approach of a very traditional Sephardi rabbi. All of those get published in this series here. There's just one volume, but just so you can see, Aselech Harav. You should make for yourself a rabbi. He also has famously a set of Shulchan Aruch that he wrote, a modern Shulchan Aruch called Mokor Chaim. And in the religious schools, it's very, very popular. To be expected to study it. There's an 8-volume edition and there's a 1-volume edition. This is the 8th volume. I have the 1 volume over there. And what we're going to look at is his response to the question about reciting this prayer that describes Yerushalayim in such depressing terms, and whether it's appropriate. And what I think we're going to see is very, very beautiful thought and ideas from him. I'm not sure whether his conclusions are the conclusions for us. I think United Synagogue communities should follow the minhagim of the United Synagogue and the Piskei Halacha of the Bet Din. But I think what is worth doing is just reading his language, just to see the Torah that he teaches us and the way that a great scholar thinks. So, are you ready for Rav Chaim David Halevi? Aselech Harav. We're going to skip over Rav Melamed for now, because we don't have a lot of time. We're going to skip over that Gemara for now, but we're going to come back to it, I think. Okay. Can you see? Let's hope so. Okay. So, says Rav Chaim David Halevi, he's been asked the question about whether one can be so depressed and say these words on Tisha B'Av. And here's his answer. B'zot sadakta. You're right. It's not simple. Gam ani hirgashti b'Tisha B'Av harishon achrei milchemet sheshet hayamim she'enin yachol lomar b'tfilati devarim eleh. I also felt after the 6-day war that I was not able on the first Tisha B'Av after the 6-day war to say those words. Shehen bechinat dover shkarim lifnei Hashem, because those are in the category, to describe Yerushalayim in this way, is in the category of lying before God. And Rav Chaim David Halevi feels deeply uncomfortable with the concept of saying something that is a lie before God, because we're supposed to speak the truth to God, because God's imprint, the rabbis say, is truth. And for that, I'll just refer you very quickly to a Gemara in Yuma. We know that the rabbis felt, that the Torah feels, that truth is incredibly important. The Torah tells us, midvar sheker tirchak. You have to keep away from anything that's remotely dishonest, meaning not just don't lie, which would be easy and obvious, but you have to keep very, very, very far away from anything that's even remotely dishonest. So, says the Gemara in Yuma, Da'ama Rabbi Hoshua ben Levi, Rabbi Hoshua ben Levi said, Lama nikra shman anshe knesset hagdola? Why are the people of the Great Assembly called by that name? Why are they addressed as being so great? Shechziru atara liyoshna, because they restored the crown to its glory. Ata Moshe Amar Hakel Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora. Moses in the Torah refers to God in the book of Devarim, we're going to read it very soon, as the Almighty, the Great, the Awesome, and the Awesome. I don't know how they translate it here. But the words that we use in the Amidah to describe God and to describe his mightiness. But says the Gemara, that this wasn't so simple for the prophets. Ata Yirmiyah, Jeremiah the prophet comes, Va'ama nochrim karkakin behechalo, ayeh noratav. He sees that there are heathens dancing on the ruins of the Bet HaMikdash, and he says, where is the awesomeness of God? And when he comes to say his Amidah, lo amar norah. He won't say the word Norah. And if you look in the book of Yirmiyahu, you'll see that his description of God mirrors that of Moshe, but misses out the word Norah. Ata Daniel, then Daniel comes, and he says, Nochrim shtabdim bavanav ayeg vorotav. That non-Jews, heathens, have subjugated the Jewish people. Where is the greatness of God? And again, he finds it impossible to refer to God as Gibor. And we'll find in the book of Daniel, if you look, you'll see that again, his words mirror those of Moshe Rabbeinu, but he misses out the word Gibor. And the Gemara goes on to say that the men of the Great Assembly were the people who restored those words. And then there's a lengthy, not very lengthy, a short description of how they face the problem of evil and the fact that God allows evil to prosper in the world. But the point that I'm making, and the point that I think Rav Chaim David Halevi is making, is that to say something that is dishonest in front of God is deeply problematic, to the extent that even our prophets, Yirmiyahu and Daniel, felt incapable of saying something that they thought was dishonest in front of God. So comes Rav Chaim David Halevi, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv Yafo, and he says, I'm looking at our situation, and it doesn't look so bad as described in the prayer. So now let's see how he goes on. Okay. So are you with me? Can you see where my little marker is? Ki lo zo bilvad, not only this, shekol hashana kula uvichud b'nei hachag v'hamoed, because all year long, and especially when it's a festival, or the intermediate days of a festival, kolel hey v'kaf hey be'iyah, including Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, shokeket Yerushalayim hamon hogeg. Jerusalem is full of people celebrating, alafim alafim, banecha shel ha'uma ba'im el Yerushalayim ha'chogeget, v'hakranat osher v'simcha. Thousands of people come to Yerushalayim, and they're full of joy and rejoicing, and they bring that to the city. Umanika hachusha kavod mamlachti, and they bring this kind of national sense of celebration. Belev kol adam Yisrael, so everyone's feeling this incredible sense of joy in Yerushalayim. Ella, and now here comes the real crunch. Can you see? Are you with me? We're on the top line here. Ella, she'afilu b'tisha b'av, even on Tisha B'av, Yom ha'evel ha'le'umi, our day of national mourning, ka'asher ba'im hamonei Beit Yisrael el ha'kotel ha'maravi, when thousands of people, the masses of Jews, come to the Western Wall, mu'utefet be'evlam, and they're full of mourning. They're cloaked in mourning. Al chorban habayit, because of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Gam az murgeshet pana mesuyemet belibi. He says, even so, I felt this kind of joy in my heart. Ela lo yachol lachdo ha'evel. My heart couldn't be pierced by mourning. Zo pana shel simcha areshit smichat geulatenu. I felt this incredible sense of joy at the beginning of the flowering of the redemption of the Jewish people. V'oto kotel, and even that Western Wall, shiadur gam b'shmo kotel hadmaot, which is known as the Wall of Tears, or the Wailing Wall, which is a term my father objected to immensely. He thought it was a British slur on the Jewish people. Shebo niglata shchinat Hashem tamid kol hayamim, the place where the Shechina came to the Jewish people always. Gam achrei hachorban, even after the Chorban, v'haya Atuya b'bigdei kodesh k'doret v'hoshech, a place where people were covered in darkness because of the loss. You know what, we're going to go over to the English because I can see the time's ticking by. Whenever Jewish people went there, they immediately felt moved to tears over the exile of the Shekhinah. Nowadays, when people go there, even on Tisha B'Av, they cannot help but feel rejoicing when they see masses of Jewish people filling the courtyard of the Mikdash. It seems that even the Shekhinah of God is no longer cloaked in darkness and melancholy, confronted by the united city, a city which has been joined together under Israeli sovereignty. So I think the next thing to point out is not only Rav Chaim David Halevi's hatred of anything that has a whiff of dishonesty to it before God, his determination always to have integrity when he stands before God, but also what's very lovely is his deep honesty, that he writes that even though it's probably not the traditional thing to feel happiness on Tisha B'Av, that inside him there is this little stroke of joy at seeing the Jewish people back in its homeland, back at the Western Wall, thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews, something that generations could only dream of. And I adore his honesty in pointing that out. And I adore his joy at seeing the Jewish people, because part of being a Jew, we know very, very well, is to be able to identify with the feelings of your people. You know, the Rambam describes as one of the sins for which one cannot, that it's very hard at least to repent, and for which a person has no place in the world to come, is when you cut yourself off from the joy and the celebrations and also the sadness of Am Yisrael. To relate to your people is part of what it means to be a Jew, and especially part of what it means to be a posek. And what's so lovely is Rav Chaim David Halevi's feelings as a posek. Therefore, there is no doubt that it's a deceit before God to say of Jerusalem that it's in mourning and ruins, despised and desolate, and particularly according to the Ashkenazi version, which says she's in mourning for she is without children and she's in ruins from her dwellings. She is despised for the loss of her glory. She's desolate from having no inhabitants. This is certainly untrue. For this reason, and this is the change that Rav Chaim David Halevi makes, I accustomed myself to add just one word, to change just one word of the words of Nachem in order to flee from falsehoods. So I say, comfort, O Lord our God, the mourners of Zion, the mourners of Jerusalem, for so long as the temple is not rebuilt, we are still immersed in grief. The city that was in mourning and in ruins, despised and desolate, with her head covered. So what Rav Chaim David Halevi does is he essentially changes a single word of the prayer and puts it in the past tense. He says we should carry on mourning for Yerushalayim. The Beit HaMikdash isn't rebuilt, but we have to recognize that there's something very much alive and wonderful and well about Yerushalayim. It's interesting to see how other rabbis relate to what he does. Rav Goren, who is also the chief rabbi of Israel and a great Ashkenazi posek, he does something very, very similar to Rav Chaim David Halevi. He also changes very, very slightly a word or two in the prayer, and he orders everyone, certainly all of the army, because he publishes the Siddur for the army, to say the revised version with one word put in the past tense to reflect the situation. Interestingly, after the Oslo peace accords with the PLO, which disturbed him greatly, he reverted back to the old version. He said, Oslo, the compromises over Eretz Israel were too much to bear. And for that reason, he felt that it was wrong to make any changes in the prayer. And that really is the psak, which we find in Rav Melamed. Rav Melamed's Pnine Halacha has become a very, very popular work of halacha. It's superb. I'm a huge fan of it, and you see it all over the place now in all sorts of yeshivot. And you have the set here. Here's one volume. It's now coming out in English. This is the Hebrew version. And you can also find it online, both the Hebrew and some of the English translations. So Rav Melamed is of the view that we shouldn't change the prayer. We should keep it as it is, because we're not there yet. And I think one of the things I think there are really two really important things that we have to remember on Tisha B'Av, and with this I'll conclude. Number one is we're mourning the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. Sometimes that's a difficult thing to relate to. We have to work on relating to it. We have to think deeply, read deeply, learn deeply to try to understand what it is that we've lost. Number two is that we have to recognize the incredible miracle of the state of Israel. It is a mind-boggling miracle. And every day I feel that miracle more and more and more. And I'm overwhelmed by it more and more and more with every passing day. And the sense that we have to have gratitude to God for our ability to be able to walk around God's land, to live in it, to rule it, and to create a Jewish homeland in it. And in that we see in the words of Rav Chaim David Halevi. But I think the third thing that's also important to remember is that we must never become arrogant about this land. We have to remember that we live here because God has granted us permission to be here for the time being, but our living here depends on our behavior, and it depends on us building the most ethical, compassionate, spiritual society that we possibly can. It seems to me Tisha B'Av and the Fast of Tammuz are incredibly important, because if we didn't have them, we'd be saying, we've done it, we've made it, we've achieved it. But for Am Yisrael, we never quite feel that way, because the concept of Kedusha is always expressed in the future. Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be a holy people. Anshe Kodesh tihiyu, you must aspire to be a holy people. But never ever should we be so arrogant as to think we've made it. And what Tisha B'Av reminds us is that there's still plenty of work for Jews in England and in Israel to do in order to build communities that are absolute models of compassion and love and joy and sensitivity and spirituality and observance of God's Torah. So please God, the Messiah will make it before Tisha B'Av, and we won't have to fast, because I, for one, hate fasting. But if that doesn't happen, then we should all have an easy fast on Tisha B'Av. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me, and continued strength in your community of Edgware.
Okay, thank you very much. You could, anyone can unmute yourselves now. Let's see. Yeah, you can unmute yourselves if you want to. Thank you, Rabbi Sylvester, for joining us. Thank you for those very appropriate words and timely words about Jerusalem and Tisha B'Av. I like your anecdote about that Rabbi having his granola on the Fast of Tammuz. But yeah, I didn't know what you were going to say there. I thought you were going to come up with something a bit controversial there. But like that's why I put the record button on. But anyway. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you will have a good week and have an easy fast on Sunday, and we'll see you again next Tuesday, hopefully. And as I say, I'll advise you if we know what we're going to be doing next week, whether we're allowed to meet in person or whether we will continue on Zoom or do a combination of both. I'll let you know. Have a good week. Thank you again, Rabbi Sylvester. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.